This week on Security Weekly, we bring on Bill Olson from Tenable Network Security to talk about the vulnerability maturity model, likely in an immature way. In security news for this week, HD Moore leaves Rapid7, FireEye buys iSight Partners, and reasons why you should build your own Wi-Fi router. All that and more, so stay tuned. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. Black Hills Information Security, the leaders in penetration testing and active defense. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to request a quote today. NetSparker, the developers of the only false positive-free web application security scanners, enabling you to automatically identify vulnerabilities and security flaws in all of your websites, web applications, and web services. NetSparker scanners are available in 2 editions, NetSparker Desktop and NetSparker Cloud, the enterprise online scanning service. For more information, visit their website at netsparker.com/securityweekly. The SANS Institute, the most trusted source for computer security training, certification, and research. Visit sans.org to explore the full curriculum and latest training offerings. Welcome, everyone, to Security Weekly. This is episode 448 for January 21st, 2015. I'm joined here.
How about 2016?
2016 even. No, I don't have a time machine. If I did... Well, anyway, Mr. Jeff Mann is here in studio. Welcome, Jeff.
Keeping it real.
Keeping it real.
Paul.
Apollo Clock is in here mixing cocktails. I said it the very Boston way,
Thank
too.
you,
Clock.
Apollo.
Anytime, keeping you guys good and
yes, well lubricated.
well lubricated.
As it were. On the lines via Skype, Mr. Joff Thayer has joined us. Welcome, Joff.
G'day, Paul and Jeff and Apollo. Good to see everybody this lovely evening.
And, of course, Michael Santarcangelo is here with us. Welcome, Michael, to the show.
It's always nice to be with you.
Yes.
My fellow Panthers fans.
Yes,
I don't know about that. Must be pretty good to be a Panthers fan. They do have a good team. I will give you that much.
Yeah.
I forgot to put the notes in here. InfoSec World 2016 Conference and Expo, April 4th through the 6th. 4th through the 6th. I can't get my years right. It is 2016.
It is 2016.
Yeah, we're just reconfirming that. Just seeing if you're paying attention, okay? It's at Disney's Contemporary Resort. There will be all kinds of training and presentations. infosecworld.misty.com for more information. I will be there presenting, as well as a lot of other people you probably recognize. You'll be there. Excellent.
I'm actually hosting the CISO Leadership Summit.
Excellent.
Wow.
Excellent. That's awesome. Well, we should hang out while I'm out there.
I was going to say, we might actually get together.
We might actually see each other in person for once. So that's great. That's really all I had on announcements. I want to introduce a very special guest for this evening, Bill Olson, who is a product manager for Tenable Network Security. Bill, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Been
Yes.
a long-time dream of mine.
Yeah.
As they say in New York, a long-time listener, first-time Skyper.
Yes, I am glad to make your dreams come true, Bill.
Squirrel.
Oh, boy. So Bill and I are, and Jeff are co-workers, obviously, at Tenable. And Bill and I were in a meeting, and Bill started talking about all this like really smart stuff about the vulnerability maturity curve, and I was like, wow, the first thing I said to him when you like went through your whole spiel, Bill, I'm like, can I steal that for my presentation? Because that's like a lot of times Bill and I are on the same page, maybe not all the time, but most of the time, and I'm like, dude, I'm totally feeling that. And then I was like spending some more time thinking about this vulnerability maturity curve, and came up with a variation of my own, and I'm like, Bill, you totally have to come on the show and talk about it. So, Bill, tell us, like, first, before we get into that, a little bit about you. How did you get your start in information security?
I'm almost embarrassed to tell the story, but
Even better.
yeah,
You're in the right place.
Yes.
I'm old, so this goes way back in the time machine when probably some of the people listening or watching weren't even born yet. But I started working in the kind of on the periphery of the IT space. And during that time, I met a gentleman who said, "Hey, you really should come work for me. I have a really cool small business that supports a lot of organizations in the greater New York City area. You know, some of the really big banks, some of the very large advertising agencies, all of which have headquarters, you know, in greater Manhattan or, you know, in the greater New York City area." And while we were there, so I decided to join him. And while we were there in the early 90s, we were making a fortune charging for bodies. I mean, literally, you know, from a body shop perspective, we were billing out, you know, greater than $200 an hour for help desk stuff. And we did a lot of message management systems and converted people from CC Mail and all Microsoft Mail and all sorts of other antiquated things that people don't even know exist anymore into, you know, Lotus Notes or into commercial products. But we immediately realized, because we were smart, that...
See, that's funny, Bill. It means you're older than me because I was converting people off Lotus Notes into something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm old. So we realized pretty quickly, because we were smart, that what we were charging $200-300 an hour for help desk leads or smart people were instantly drying up because people were outsourcing that to overseas and things like that for $70, $60, $50, $40 an hour. So we decided, hey, we should build a security practice. So I bought a book, and I became our resident security expert. I have the book somewhere, not in... Actually, the book is in Jersey. I'm in Florida now, in Hacking Exposed. And lo and behold, I had become someone that got into the security business. And then from there, it dovetailed into figuring out how firewalls worked and how remote access permissions should be created. And we became jack of all trades and masters of many in that space. So I'm embarrassed to say I got my start in the book.
Well, I mean, you got to get your start somewhere, Bill. And then, so you've been in the vulnerability management space for roughly how long?
Well, so we started doing that, I would say, in 96, 97. So, yeah, and when Nessus was first born, and prior to that, it was ISS and McAfee's vulnerability management product that basically created a space from whence there wasn't a space. So it was in the late 90s. So I've been doing it now for coming up on 20 years.
Wow.
Too long.
You've worked for companies, Qualys, you worked for Qualys, now you work for Tenable,
Correct.
And you are now product manager for Security Center, which is really, really interesting. It was interesting to hear your perspective when you came on board. But now, how did you come up with this vulnerability management maturity curve?
It was
Bill?
in the book, obviously.
It was in the book. It was in Hacking Exposed. I remember that now.
No.
Which edition of the book did you start with, Bill?
Say that again?
Which edition of the book did you start with?
I think it was the first one. So it was that old. So
Did it come with a CD? I think I had that book.
yeah, they did.
Yeah.
It was like
think I
the
had that
whole
too.
hacker toolkit.
Yes, in those days, they used to all come with the CD that you could pick up at Barnes & Noble and cause havoc in your environment. Yes. Yes. So
I think
how
I bought it, but I never read it.
So to answer your question, how I came up with the concept was I needed a way to communicate to people in an organization that sort of had a common framework or a common sets of definitions in a way that people could, understand where they were overall. There are a lot of maturity models out there, and I think I can't remember the most common one, where there are 4 levels, and you look at it that way, or 5 levels. But I think in talking to a variety of people, I started to recognize that almost every organization that I met with was doing vulnerability management wrong for a variety of reasons.
Yep,
And
I agree. Also, I mean, when people ask you questions, Bill, you're probably tired of saying it depends, right? I mean, I've been working for Tenable for 6 or 7 years now, and they would ask me, well, it depends. It depends on what? And then Bill presents thing. I'm like, oh, well, where they are on the vulnerability maturity curve, right?
yeah, being able to put yourself in the process somewhere along the line and recognize that you have a problem is, the first step to recovery that everyone says. So if you want to improve in any way, shape, or form, you have to kind of know where you're starting from. And I think a lot of people try to tackle vulnerability management from a variety of points where, they think that if they're scanning, they're doing vulnerability management. They think if they're scanning once a week, they're doing vulnerability management. They think if they scan and they email everybody CSV reports, they're doing vulnerability management. And none of those things are really vulnerability management at all. And I used to tease people in a previous life with an interview question to ask them to define, what's the difference between vulnerability assessment and vulnerability management, and sit back and listen to the answers that you get back. And it's often quite surprising how, I'll use the proper English word, ignorant people are as to what the industry would consider it as the proper definitions, or even what they should consider in their own organization the proper definition.
Right. And it was interesting to me, Bill, and I'm going to ask the production people. I have my version of the vulnerability management maturity curve that we're going to put up on the live stream and in the video. And it was interesting to me that it didn't matter, both you and myself, when we talk to people, the size of the organization didn't matter. You still find that people are in varying levels of security.
Yep.
Of the maturity model, right?
Yep.
And now, how often do you encounter people that do nothing?
Well, how do you define do nothing? I mean, they've given up on all preventative measures, so they're not going to look because they don't know how bad it is.
Yeah, they don't want to look.
They don't want to know how bad it is.
Right, they don't want to look.
How I manage my checkbook, if I never look, I'll never know how bad it is,
right.
That kind of model. I would say at this point that number is growing low. As we grow into 2016, what sales would call a greenfield market is fairly small. But as recently as 2013, I worked with a Fortune 50 organization that was doing zero vulnerability management. And I mean literally at the do nothing stage. Their security program was 100% paper-based. So they asked everyone to, does your system have vulnerabilities? No. Do you patch your system? Yes. So check. And their paper form, allowed that system to be blessed or that program to be blessed, and they moved forward from there. So, but that was a Fortune 50 company.
Michael, are you going to jump in?
So I got a question for you on that.
Oh, hey, John.
Hey, dude. So I got a question on the Fortune 50 company. Do you think at core there's really that much difference between companies that have no vulnerability management at all and those that really don't have a centralized approach to vulnerability management? And the reason why I say that is you have some organizations that are very large. They don't have an institutional level policy or process on how to handle it, but they have all these weird little silos, like the small little organizations within the big organization are doing kind of vulnerability management on a one-off. Do you think that that's actually better, or do you think that's worse, or do you really think it's about the same? And the reason why I ask is because a lot of organizations like to say, well, yeah, we do that. We know we got Jim in Hoboken is running vulnerability management, therefore we qualify. So what's your take on organizations that kind of have a scattered approach versus those that really don't do anything at all?
So in today's global market and the businesses that exist, I think the only way to truly be successful is to have global oversight with a distributed control model. So even if there's no global oversight, if someone is still doing something inside, like we are, this division is doing something, but the global part isn't necessarily doing something, or this division is, here on the maturity curve and the other divisions are much lower or much higher on the maturity curve, I would say that it's much better than doing nothing, because if you don't know what you have, you can't put a strategy in place to protect it. I mean, that simplest rule that everyone should live by is better than doing nothing.
So
hold on. I just want to put just to start framing the conversation, if we could put up the maturity curve that I came up with, and Bill, you should be able to see that once they switch to it. Yep. So I started at do nothing, and then I went to they're scanning and distributing raw results. Then the next level is they're emailing Excel documents with some level of analysis to them. And then I can't even see that. Wow, old. Yeah, and then they're doing scheduled scans, right? And then integrated remediation. So they're doing something to help to have people actually do something as a result of the vulnerability scans, right?
Can I do my best Michael Santarcangelo imitation and simply ask, what does it mean when you say vulnerability management? Can you give us a working definition?
No. It's what's the problem you're trying to solve?
That's right.
No, I'm
That is
sorry.
the first question.
That was my best impression. I didn't say it
Yeah,
was a
what
good
exactly is the problem you're trying to solve here? There's
So-
the impression.
Oh, I like that. Was nice. I
Because
wish I could have
I
that.
suspect when you say vulnerability management, there might be one or two or more people out there that are
you keep
thinking
using
different
that
things.
phrase.
If
I don't
you-
think it means
if-
what you think it means.
When you exactly.
Right, exactly.
When you look at the curve, though, I tried to assign what scanning is, what assessment means, and I ended assessment at scheduled scans. You start getting into management when we talk about integrated remediation, basic metrics, which you see the curve dips there. We'll get to that. Management buy-in, third-party integration, business-based metrics. I stole that from Bill. And then I added automating remediation as like the panacea, utopia of vulnerability management. That's where I drew the line between scanning, assessment, and management. I don't know. You debate. Talk amongst yourselves.
All right, so what problem are you trying to solve?
I think it's
All of
easy
them?
though. So, like we can make this real simple. If you have a plan of action and milestones, you're doing vulnerability management because you're looking at vulnerabilities and you're saying these ones we can fix, these ones we cannot fix right now. We have a plan for addressing these vulnerabilities. We have mitigation. That is managing your vulnerabilities. If you run a scan and you disperse the scan results to a whole bunch of people, you're just scanning. You're not doing true vulnerability management unless you're having a group of people to get together, come up with a plan of action for dealing with them. That's my take, and I could be wrong, but that's
Yeah, Bill, I want to get your take,
Discuss.
Bill, because you were the first one to come up with this curve thing, and I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, I wasn't the first one, but I was the crazy one that wrote it down on a piece of paper. But so I would disagree, Josh, that's vulnerability management, and here's why. What you described is a project, and projects have a beginning, a middle, and end.
I didn't
Vulnerability
describe a
management.
project. That's not with a plan of action and milestones. You have multiple different vulnerabilities that you are managing. It's managing multiple different projects that do have a beginning and an end. If you have a vulnerability, like a cross-site scripting vulnerability in a website, you've identified it, it's a beginning. You're addressing it, that's the middle. It's been addressed and remediated and tested that it's been remediated, that's an end. That's one component of a plan of action and milestones.
Until
But a
it-
plan of action and milestones is a collection of all of those little projects that you're working.
Until that vulnerability comes back.
Well, so
Well,
here's
and
the thing
that's spoken from the perspective of a pen tester. I think
No.
there's
Yeah.
I think there's another definition for vulnerability management.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, Josh, and you're not wrong. But
That's John, by
John.
the way. John.
John, sorry, I can't read the little icons that come up as names. So
That's okay.
to me,
I go by
it's-
Josh, it's fine.
all right. I'll just,
Your new
I'll just say
That
Fred.
damn Josh Wright, he's an asshole. They're like, all right.
So I wouldn't. You can't think about it as individuals because if you're individually managing vulnerabilities, in the maturity curve, you're way down in the bottom, and I would say you're more in the assessment process because you're assessing and then figuring out an action plan to manage that assessment. I have this report. I need to work through this report. And then I move on to the next report. I work through that report with milestones, and because what we're forgetting is that there's a whole pile of business.
I think we're working from two very fundamentally different definitions of what a poem is. But go ahead.
Yeah, so perhaps that's the case. But when I think of vulnerability management, and we think of being in the higher curve, it really kind of lines up to what Paul put in the document, in the graphic, where once we start integrating the program of assessment, reporting, distributing, conversating about what these things mean to the organization, perhaps putting risk ratings and understanding what the threats are and putting the things in what I call context. At that point, you're integrated into the business. You're starting to get people to respond and understand what a pile of data means and put it into, like I said, context. So for me, that is the baseline of vulnerability management. If you're doing that, then you're doing vulnerability management. If you're out playing the whack-a-mole game, then it's less management and more of assessment, in my opinion. That's the way I view it.
Well, it'd be like vulnerability reactive.
Yes,
Yes.
that's a good way of saying it.
I think you just said a really key piece of information there that I think a lot of people miss in daily process in security, and that is local context. Because we have a lot of let's face it, pick your vulnerability scanner of choice, right? It uses CVSS has a standardized kind of rating system, but one of the key pieces of information you just said is that as part of a vulnerability management program, people are zooming in and giving it a risk rating that is locally contextual to that organization. That's a big difference. That's a more mature program, in my opinion, than just a kind of a scanning program.
And Joff, you hit on a point as to why that graph has a dip in it, right? And Bill and I talked about this, I think it was last week. And I said, people that do basic reporting, sometimes, and not all the time, but most of the time, they take a step backwards because they're like, well, I got all these vulnerabilities, and yeah, I'm working with people to get them fixed, but I can't deal with all of them. So everything greater than CVSS of 7, we must fix it in this amount of time, blanket statement across the whole organization. And that's just not how things work, largely because what Joff said, it's contextual to your organization, and you can't fix everything all the time, all at once. You just can't, right? And that's where some of the management comes in. You have to manage that. You have to understand that, yes, there's a group that runs these systems and runs this application. It means this to the business. They have a tolerance to maintain this standard of vulnerabilities, that we can withstand this, a severity or this number of vulnerabilities for this long in this organization, and you're managing it and tracking it. So if they go outside of your tolerance level, you're flagging it and you're saying, well, what do you need more resources? Do you need different technology? Or more time? Like, what do you need to mitigate that risk? And to me, that really kind of speaks to what Joff is saying and Bill is saying about management.
So I find it utterly amazing that in what year is it, Paul?
It's 2016. 16. Yes.
That we're having this kind of conversation.
I know.
Right? Because when you think about from a security perspective, this was, you could argue, one of the first types of tools that were created that we've used. And it's one that maybe people that move up through the ranks, they have been involved in some way, shape, or form with a scanner and used it in some way, shape, or form inside their organization. And yet, regardless of the size of the organization, when you look at people and you look at their people's programs, they're all fundamental. And I shouldn't say all. I'm making a broad statement, but in many cases, they're really kind of broken. And I like when we did the basic metrics dip, because one of the things, and I could rant about this for hours, is trending. And so I think of basic metric as a trend. And if you want to look at your 401k or your stock market portfolio, you would hope
this week.
Yeah, exactly. Or last week, or you're going the wrong way. Right. But you would hope that it would be trending in the upward space, right? But when we look at vulnerability management for trending, and we put that basic metrics around what are our goals, we're trying to achieve something. We teach people somehow, and I say we being the industry, we have taught our customer base, or the consumers of the data, that there's a goal out there that's achievable, which is 0. And that goal is not achievable. I would argue there's almost no way to get to 0. Putting PCI aside, Jeff, Jeff.
Jeff. Yeah, Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff, I did get it right.
Yeah.
Putting PCI aside, no. Jeff,
I
man.
think you should just collectively call them all Jay.
No. I like calling every single one of them. Jay works good, or Josh works even better.
Yeah, that works even better. Yeah, that's good.
No, if you say PCI, you absolutely can call him Jeff.
I was calling Jeff. I was calling out Jeff.
But no, I see where you're going, Bill. I agree. Like, the race to 0 vulnerabilities in your environment is one you're never going to win, right? I mean, Oracle today. If you have Oracle, you have 236 new vulnerabilities to worry about. And we cover the security news every week. And how often do we say, well, Microsoft comes out with their patches when there's a new vulnerability.
At least we never talk about WordPress.
At least we don't talk about how many vulnerabilities are in WordPress or Adobe products.
But Bill's pointed out something I think is really important to look at too, which is, we've conditioned people in risk assessments that red is bad, okay, good, and green is good. And so they're like, well, I want it all green. if everything was green, if you could race to zero, think about the enormous waste of resources that you've committed. And from a business perspective, that's poor prioritization and decision making. There's some level of risk that's tolerable. We call that, this is odd, we call it risk tolerance, and it's acceptable. We got to manage to that level. It's so zero is not only not attainable, it's not realistic. It's not a good choice.
But it comes down to knowing which vulnerabilities that you need to fix, right? Now, Joff and John can tell you about the vulnerabilities that they find in organizations, and they do a very good job, right, in organizations pointing out, and you should fix those because that's how we broke in, right? Bill and I approach it from a slightly different thing. We're like, well, there's different ways to look at your vulnerabilities to help you understand which ones you need to fix. There's lots of ways to do that. So, Joff and John, you want to comment on, the load opponent and how we integrate that into our programs?
So I think that's a big thing. I don't know who just said, we're trying to get rid of red, and that's bad because we're looking at things in the wrong direction.
Josh was a J name.
Josh was brilliant with that. But I think that whenever you're dealing with vulnerability management, it actually goes a little bit bigger than that. I mean, you want to take care of the vulnerabilities, get things patched, but you want to address the lows, the informationals, and the mediums. And people freak out. And they're like, you can't do that, and they're wrong. You absolutely can address them. Most of the time when people are trying to do vulnerability management and completely are overwhelmed by it, they're approaching it incorrectly from a technical perspective. But even bigger than that, if you're looking at trying to deal with vulnerability management, a lot of it has a much more larger scale idea of how do you mitigate. So if you know that you have vulnerabilities, like I'm willing to bet that all organizations that are over 20,000 have an insecure version of Adobe Acrobat in their environment, or they have an insecure version of Java. So that's going to happen, and it's always going to exist. So what's the mitigation beyond that? So it's not just trying to fix the patches, but it's also about architecturally, can we put in something like internet whitelisting? Can we actually do, if we have to have Java running in our environment, can we restrict from what websites Java applets are allowed to execute via PowerShell restrictions? There's a ton of things that you can do that are vulnerability management that are far beyond just patching a damn vulnerability. You can actually step it back and actually start addressing these vulnerabilities from a vulnerability management perspective architecturally. Well, and that is one of the big things that I see.
You're starting to get at, Josh, what I was asking in the question, defining vulnerability management, because I think within the vulnerability industry with which Paul, Bill, and I run, we have a certain perspective, and there's a certain expectation that vulnerability management is find it, fix it, mitigate it, make it go away. Whether it's to zero or not, that's sort of irrelevant. But to me, when I think about vulnerability management, I'm thinking about just what you're talking about. What are the other ways of discovering or eliminating or managing the vulnerabilities that are out there that are going to stay out there? And it's tied it's tied into pen testing. Back in the early days, I think the first tool was a vulnerability scanner in the industry, because everybody wanted to find out what the problems are. And I sometimes think that the vulnerability industry is still locked in that mentality that's how it all starts. That's
so beautiful, because ultimately it is not an Easter egg hunt. No. You're not going to find all the Easter eggs.
well, that's interesting, because I did a test last week that really illustrated this, and what John's really talking about is the diversity of compensating controls, and it doesn't just have to be patch management. And in this particular test,
that's a great point. Yep.
In this particular test, we had strict controls on application whitelisting. We had strict controls on things like running cmd.exe, PowerShell.exe, all of the different variants of command level control you could run on the workstation. We had very strict network segmentation that kept us away from particular servers that the organization knew were vulnerable, but they needed to buy themselves some time to to address that with the vendor. So there's this whole array of compensating controls that you can put out there to address the issue that go way beyond just patch, mitigate, fix.
I love that, Joff, because it's not about building security in layers. It's diversity of compensating controls. It sounds so much better.
That sounds really nice.
Now, Bill, I want to go back to you. When you're faced with the problem and you meet with tons of potential customers and have for a long time, no matter where you've worked, right? When you're presented with the problem, when they're like, oh, we just have too many vulnerabilities, we'll never get to the the mediums and lows. What do we do? How do we prioritize our remediation or compensating controls efforts?
So it's interesting you're having this conversation about the compensating controls, because I think on the maturity curve, recognizing that you have them in the first place is a unique way of understanding where you are from a vulnerability management perspective, because most organizations don't think about it that way. And to flip it around for just a second, on the other end of the spectrum, one of the questions I often ask organizations is, well, in your organization, what drives patching? And you get weird looks like, well, what do you mean? And I said, well, is the single source or the sole source of information that drives patching in your organization the vulnerability management scan or the vulnerability assessment scan,
No,
the
it's
tool?
Patch Tuesday.
Well, well, you would hope that is correct.
No, it's
But
Patch Tuesday.
well, you would still hope that that's correct, but I was at an organization yesterday in the middle of the country, and this is a multi-billion-dollar national organization that has been doing this for years and has no policy in place that Patch Tuesday drives patching. So what drives patching in the organization is the output of the vulnerability scanner, in which case then they're overwhelmed by data and they have no idea where to start, in which case then they don't even get to the place of thinking about, well, what compensating or mitigating or what other possible control could we have that would take these vulnerabilities, threats, or potential risks and put us in a place where we could look at what is our effective risk, which I learned from an organization in Australia. I think of that's a great way of looking at things is, well, what's my effective score? Because I have these compensating controls or I have these other things that whitelist it, and that even though I have this Java vulnerability, it can't reach the internet or it can't be used because I have these compensating controls or mitigating controls around it. That's an interesting way of spinning it, but I would put organizations that can think that way pretty much at the end of the curve. Whereas most of the organizations are still driving patching by their scanner, in which case then they're back to the point that John brought up where they're looking at it, I would argue, in a project-based model. And it's not integrated into the business because management thinks that if we just keep patching them, we'll get to zero.
Well, I agree with that, and I didn't mean to imply that Patch Tuesday was a good approach. I think it's also not the right approach, because what you're starting to talk about when you bring up the word risk is the risk equation. And there's a million risk equations out there, and I've been working on them for longer than I'd care to admit to. But at its most basic level, risk is some sort of function of vulnerabilities plus threats taking away whatever you do in terms of what we used to call countermeasures, and that could be mitigations, compensating controls, monitoring, whatever. So to me, when we're talking about vulnerability management, we're only talking about one element or variable of a larger equation. Do we have a risk maturity model? Do we have a threat maturity model? Do we have a countermeasure, whatever, mitigation maturity model? And do we have that overall model that ties all of that together? Which is a little bit, I come from a DoD background where it's a little bit, theoretical, but that's my mindset. When we're talking vulnerabilities alone, and so many companies lead with the scan or only jump when Patch Tuesday comes out, they're all missing the point that there's another way of looking at it.
That was deep, Jeff.
Thank you.
Deep thoughts with Jeff Mann. Look, let me point out something too that maybe was implied, but I want to put a finer point on it. Having a model gives you something to discuss. So they want to talk about the problem you want to solve or how you want to define the terms. Having a model means there's at least a mechanism by which somebody can evaluate it. It's a mechanism by which they can think about it. And if they buy into and adopt the model, then you've laid out where they are and what their best next step is. And that's fantastic. There's no other way to improve. So, I mean, that's great. And what this discussion lays out for us is that there may be room to improve the model that's there, or there may be room to change where it fits or how it works, or there's a number of things there, but that it's done and that it's talked about is fantastic.
See, and I like that last quote. It's kind of funny because people listening to the show, and if your company if somebody is listening to the show and their company is having the argument as far as what vulnerability management actually is, I'm willing to bet you're probably okay. If you're listening to this show and you're like, what the hell are these guys talking about? I I think that we might have a problem.
We can
just by
help
the
you.
fact, and we can help you.
Admitting you have a vulnerability problem is the first
step.
step.
Exactly.
That's right. That's right. Bill, I want to go ahead.
Well, no,
Mike.
I'm sorry. But I just want to. I mean, John's right. But also, if you're listening to this show now and you're going, guys, I've never even thought about it this way, then grab that model or have somebody take a look at this. And when they're like, "Whoa, that's too much stuff," be like, "Cool. Where do you want to start? I mean, where are we on this curve? Where are we in this model? How does this work?" Because look, the risk of most of us have been doing this now for longer than a decade. A couple of us, it sounds like 2 decades or longer. Great. So we've seen a lot of this, and to us, it's like, my goodness, we've been doing this for 20 years.
I'm in my 4th decade. Go ahead.
And there's some of you doing it
I
a
was going
little
to say
longer
5
than
or
that.
6, but
So, but there are still people that this is new to them, and
Right.
and
No, I
what's
agree.
the advantage is now at least we can encapsulate 2 or 3 decades of experience into something that they can look at. If you don't agree with it, that's awesome. And John's right. If people are at the point where they want to argue these things, yeah, they're probably less concerned. But it doesn't mean they're heading in a positive direction. It just means they're doing a lot of motion, and that's great.
Well, and
Actually, no, it's
unfortunately,
not.
not only if they start thinking about it and they're not sure where to turn, unfortunately, the way this industry works is they're usually going to respond to the shiniest object, the
That's where I was
most
going.
compelling.
Talking about my head.
I can compete with you. The most compelling salesman, what's been written up in the latest trade rag or whatever we call those in this modern technology world. But I've been to many companies over the years where the IT or security people had to go out and buy some product because the CEO read about it in whatever paper or magazine he was reading. He says, we got to get one of these things. And so they were sitting there with this thing that was supposed to do everything for them, and they had no idea what to do with it.
now, Bill, you list out third-party integration, right? Where were you going with that? And I think it somewhat ties into what Jeff was saying as well, that there's a lot of tools out there that do a lot of different things. Well, where are some areas you should look at for third-party integration in the context of vulnerability management?
So I think one of the biggest things that comes to people's mind is tracking activity, and often that's done via some kind of ticketing application, whether it's a Remedy or a ServiceNow or something like that. And ticketing for most people is a bad word, and it brings a big cloud of doom and gloom around everything that you have. Because if you've ever had to deal with one of those systems, it's not a pleasant experience for many cases. And one of the things to think about for vulnerability management is often an organization says, we have all of this data, plop it into the ticketing system, magically assign it to everybody, and all things will be completed because of that. And while on paper it sounds like a great idea, it could be a really horrible idea from the sense of overwhelming the ticketing system, to causing people to get into analysis paralysis just because it's in a ticketing system versus being on a spreadsheet with 170,000 lines doesn't really solve. It's the same problem, just with a different delivery mechanism. Years ago, I worked with an organization that outsourced their help desk, and we were explaining the way the business wanted the ticketing system to work. So they had 10,000 desktops they were responsible for managing. So if Microsoft released 10 vulnerabilities for those 10,000 desktops, guess how many tickets it would open? A lot, right?
A lot of times the
So,
number of
but
desktops.
that gets into like one of the key things on whenever I go into organizations and see how they're doing vulnerability management or assessments, and I can tell within like 30 seconds if they're doing it wrong. If they take their vulnerability report, I'm talking about the output from the tool, and they basically break it up by IP address, and they're like, all right, well, Bill and Steve are responsible for the 192.168.10 subnet. We're going to give them all these vulnerabilities, and these guys over here are responsible for 10.10.10.x. And those guys are responsible for 172.16.4.x. They're doing it wrong. Because if you look at your vulnerabilities and you look at discrete vulnerabilities by IP address, you will have thousands of vulnerabilities. However, if you break it down to unique vulnerabilities and then have it sorted by the IP addresses associated with those vulnerabilities, I think Tenable, this is called export or sort by plugin ID. Is that correct, Paul?
Yeah, I think that's the report type.
Close enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So And then at that particular point, you can come up with a kind of an institutional approach for dealing with something. So if you see that you're missing a cold fusion patch, instead of 18 people trying to fix it on one-off systems, they can say, we have this consistent vulnerability across the entire architecture. How do we take it out in one shot? If we look at the lows, we can look at all the lows very, very quickly, because you probably have hundreds of discrete vulnerabilities that are cross-referenced to 1,000 IP addresses. You can come up with a better approach. But yeah, whenever I see people that are basically kicking it out and then sorting it by IP address, oh dear God, you're never going to get to the end of it.
And I'll do you one better, because very often, and this is why the patch, the ticketing system fails quite a bit, is even in the one-to-many or the many-to-one correlation, which I would recommend doing rather than looking at IPs, look at vulnerabilities and map them to the IPs. But the work units that people need to do are very different. And I've been saying this phrase for a very long time. Operations is measured in uptime and availability, right? So they get bonuses, they get money, they get, by keeping things up. Security runs around and tells everybody to reboot, and patch. So we're at different, we have different goals, so it's no wonder we're at odds. But we even speak different languages. We speak vulnerabilities, CVE numbers, so on and so forth. They're looking for patches. So very often, hundreds of vulnerabilities can be remediated by applying a single patch. So being able to, and this could be a good place for a third-party integration as well, being able to understand what the work effort is to remediate piles of things, and being able to visually translate that for people in an automated way is really where you start moving your program from to a much more programmatic approach inside of your environment, where you're focusing on work rather than focusing on how many vulnerabilities we're fixing. The other place, to finish the integration comment, the other place though to think about for integrations is, what do you do with the data? And the scanners, scanning tools, whether it be our products or other vendor products, they have a fairly, in most cases, myopic view of their world, right? They see a host, they evaluate the host based on ports or services that are listening, or if you're doing authenticated scanning, you're looking at the actual file system, and you're able to evaluate that these DLLs are the right ones or the wrong ones, or so on and so forth. But it's fairly myopic. But if you were to take that context that we create, that single way of looking at the data, and plot it across a number of places in the environment, that risk view that Jeff was talking about, or the understanding what compensating and mitigating controls, this really starts to put organizations into a better light of, well, not only do we need to know what we need to fix, but where we need to focus our shields, where we have a potential weakness. And what I think the biggest benefit to a third-party integration is where the customer often thinks it's a reduction of work, where I think the biggest benefit is their ability to understand what's broken. Why are these problems consistently appearing in John's group? Does John do we need more Johns? Do we need to get rid of that John? Is it a people problem? Is it a process problem?
Is it a technology problem? Does that technology just suck, right?
Exactly. What's broken? And if you're running around looking at spreadsheets and not looking at the data across a variety of other things, I would argue that most organizations don't have a method to even see the problem. You can't see the forest because there's too many trees in the way, kind of thinking.
No, I would agree with that. And I think more times than not, it's a process problem. And one of the processes might be why you go out and buy products that have that are rife with so many vulnerabilities in the first place. There's also a level where, so you find vulnerabilities, but when you go and try to fix them, you find out, well, the vulnerabilities are associated with the operating system, but you can't, or they fear updating the operating system because whatever legacy applications running on that server, they fear or they know it will break.
Right.
And they're stuck.
The technology sucks.
And that's where you get into the compensating control. What else do we do? Because it's going to be there, every time you scan, every time you go through whatever.
Well, maybe the technology doesn't suck, though. I shouldn't say that. It could be perfectly good technology. It's doing the job. It's solving the business need. But the problem is it can't be patched. And I guess that makes it suck because now you're running in fear of the integrity of that system being compromised.
Right.
Yeah, but here's the thing. How do you have the intelligence to separate out all of those things? So I have this mind picture, this thing in my head, whatever you call those things. I have this idea of what you could
It's
see.
a little balloon that bubbles up. We can
Exactly.
see it right above your head.
Over my head.
It's a light bulb. Go.
Of a data cube, okay? And think about it this way for a second. One side of the cube is everything. All of the vulnerabilities, every way that you've scanned, collected them, all of your threats, whether they're from a scanner or from a pen test or from an outside threat intel vendor, however you're getting. There's one side of the cube is everything. Flip the cube around, make it simple, give me all the vulnerabilities that have a known exploit, right? So these are things that potentially are more risky than the other things that don't have exploits. Flip the cube around and these are all the vulnerabilities that are protected by some compensating control or mitigating control. Flip the cube around again. These are all the vulnerabilities I can't fix. But why? I can't fix them because I can't find the owner. I can't fix them because it breaks the business application. I can't fix them because it costs too much money. But if you're a CISO and you can't see the data in that way, how do you go to the board? How do you go to anyone and say, I need more money for X? Because if they're all in the same blob, you're doomed.
If you want to find the owner, just turn it off for an hour.
Yeah, well, I agree. That's one way that's fairly disruptive. I did work with a giant organization that had a methodology for remediating things. There's a nasty problem that people don't often recognize, that even though when you apply a patch to a system, it's still vulnerable. And this happens quite a bit. There's a lot of vendors, Adobe and Microsoft being two of them, that often leave the remnant file on the hard drive. So like Adobe Shockwave, they leave the vulnerable version of the OCX. I think that's the file extension. They leave it on the hard drive. Microsoft leaves all sorts of DLLs on the hard drive. I've been old enough to remember this term called patch and pray. You would apply service pack, whatever, and pray that your system would reboot and everything would work. Well, we don't really have those problems anymore. Why? I would argue that Microsoft often leaves the old stuff around because they don't know what other products, third-party applications are calling those DLLs. And not every piece of malware, when you get it, will launch Excel or launch Adobe. It will call those DLLs or those files in the background, and one might never know that they were breached. So I dealt with this one giant company that would literally go around and scrub those files off the hard drive and then wait for the phone to ring, which I was stunned because this is a multi-billion-dollar organization that would be willing to interrupt all sorts of production, potentially, by cutting out these files. And then they would put the file back and put that person on a clock. You have 90 days to figure out how to get that file off your hard drive. But yeah, you're right. Getting rid of those files or turning the machine off is one way. I'll give you one other quick way to figure out ownership problems. And this can work in many organizations, but you could be doomed pretty quickly if you tried this. So be careful what you wish for. Use this at your own risk. If you could, in your organization, come up with 10, 25 most critical business applications, and then all of the applications or products or solutions or hardware or people that support them, and put them into neat little columns, very often at the top of the column is some associate vice president or assistant vice president or executive vice president who owns those business applications. You start creating a scorecard that has their names on it that are in the red column, they'll run around and find the owner for the team that's trying to find the owner in the vulnerability space. They'll do your dirty work for you. I've seen that be fairly effective. But again,
it works a different way, too. It's a shaming thing, too. If you show up to an executive meeting armed with the information of, I know which vice presidents or associate vice presidents manage applications or systems that have the most vulnerabilities of a certain type that are, have the most risk to the organization. You show up to a meeting with all the statistics, it gets ugly.
Yeah,
gets
but
ugly.
then that VP says, yes, but I'm responsible for 80% of the revenue.
Right.
And
Well, they could pull that card, but I would argue that even more so that you should pay attention to the vulnerabilities.
But now you can have a conversation about we can accept those risks or we can't accept those risks.
Right.
So that's another part of the cube. These are the risks that we've accepted. which is fine.
I feel like this whole segment of discussion for the last 10 minutes is completely missing the point. And the point is that just sort of coming full circle is you've got to put local business context around this.
Yes.
Local business context is what are those group of server or desktop assets, and what do they mean to our business? What is the data we're managing here, and what classification is it, and how critical is it to protect? You know, all of that stuff on the maturity end of the cycle, people are going to be much more mature in their vulnerability management cycle if they know that stuff like the back of their hand, and they can actually say, okay, yeah, I know this group of servers or this group of desktops is vulnerable, but it means this to my business, which is maybe 5% of my bottom line, and it's managing some less critical systems, and we're willing to accept that risk. So, you know, it's always got to have local context, right? And everything you've been talking about is awesome, and we can go into a shaming game and all that good stuff. But the people that have the maturity are the people that know what the assets mean to their organization, bottom line.
True, but be careful. There's some foo in there, because knowing that the system generates this amount of income or manages this part of the business, and then trying to plot what the risk is against that is quite a bit of foo for a variety of people. There's a number of business applications that are trying to say, you know, SAP generates this $1 billion worth of business, and it has these 4 vulnerabilities that'll cost us $30,000 to fix, and it would reduce our risk by 2% or 1%.
Is that foo or poo?
Both.
It's foo poo foo. It's poo foo foo foo.
So what about tying the department's yearly budget or quarterly budgets to their vulnerabilities? I've heard of some companies doing that.
It's certainly another way of looking at the data. The vulnerabilities don't get fixed for 3 main reasons. You can't find the owner being the single biggest reason I've ever encountered. And if you could work through that problem in some way, shape, or form, and there's a variety of ways to do it. You know, I'm a comedian. I often ask organizations, you know, do you have a CMDB? And people start laughing hysterically because they have not only one, they have 9 or 10, and none of them are right. And they have no way of getting that business, that context. So I would say, you know, when you think about that business-based metrics on the maturity curve, if you know what your systems are worth and you know what they do and you can put that context around it, you're way ahead of everyone else, and you are winning for sure.
Yep. And you're rare.
Yeah.
You're rare. Yeah.
So do this though. So people who are interested, is this public? Can somebody grab this? How can we learn more? Because it's certainly something I'd like to continue. And we covered a lot of ground in it. But if we bring it back to, there's a model that's established that allows us to frame a conversation, bring business executives and board members into it, and start to figure out where we are and where we need to go. That's a remarkable step forward. So how do we get more of this?
Sounds like somebody has to write a blog post.
Someone has to do something other than Bill and I just like making charts and graphs and talking about it in meetings and on podcasts.
Yes.
Well,
You guys need spreadsheets.
So 2 thoughts. One is, you know, what Bill was saying earlier. You know, basically going back to a risk equation. If for some reason you could eliminate or manage all the vulnerabilities, that's only one element of a risk equation. When you still have threats to deal with, you still can be vulnerable. So you could patch your system, it could still be vulnerable. If you eliminate all your vulnerabilities, you could still risk compromise, breach, attack, data loss, whatever it is that you're trying to protect against. I would take it a step further and say most companies don't really fundamentally understand what it is they're trying to do with all of this, other than they have this, you know, this preconceived notion that, well, there's computers and networks and we got to protect it all and fix all the vulnerabilities. They don't understand the business context. They don't understand the data flows. They don't understand what it is they're trying to protect, yet alone where it is or how many places
or
it is.
My first question to every customer that I meet with is, how do you define success? And if they could give me an answer, my next question is how are you going to measure it? But most often, organizations don't have a strong definition of success. And if you're going at any problem without setting, you know, whole stops or markers or success criteria, how successful are you really going to be, regardless of the product or tool that you buy?
Right. And sort of tied into that is, we assume that part of our myopia in the industry is we assume, and everything we've been talking about today assumes a certain organizational structure to the company, to the assuming they have an IT department, if they have a separate security department or not, we assume, and I'm classically trained a long time ago, and I expect this too, you expect a certain organizational structure that just simply isn't always there at every company within every industry. And, how do you tackle that problem?
I can say this about vulnerability management. Something that really helps is a good, strong cocktails. And, thanks to Apollo for that.
Are you
tonight.
enjoying your pink
I think
cocktail?
what he's saying is we're getting low.
Not good. Here, have another cocktail. How do you feel now? Love it. These are great.
Yes. Where are you on your cocktail maturity curve? Well, Bill, unfortunately, that's all the time we have this evening. Michael, we'd love to continue the conversation. Absolutely. I think we did a good job of, covering vulnerability management in a different light than we have on the show in the past. So I thank everyone for that, especially Bill, who took time out of his schedule. Sorry, Mike, what were you saying?
Just let me know how I can help amplify it. I'm in. This is worth having that discussion more. So it's good.
I knew this would be right up your alley, too.
Are you going to take time to ask Bill a few questions?
Yes. So we're going to ask Bill the 5 questions.
Oh, no.
You ready, Bill? 5 questions with Security Weekly. You ready? Okay.
I'm ready, yes.
3 words to describe yourself.
Old, older, and not old enough.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
My mind.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
He was misunderstood.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
If those are my 2 only options, I will go first.
Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Ayrton Senna and, Marilyn Monroe.
Excellent. Bill, thank you very much for appearing on Security Weekly.
Adios, guys. Have a great night.
You too.
Thanks,
With
Bill.
that, we're going to take a short break, come back and talk about the security news for this week.